Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave, and this tutorial is part of a Node.js and Express for Beginners tutorial series. I'll put a link to the full playlist in the description below. Today, we're going to talk about creating routers in the Express.js framework. And we're going to start out with the code repository from the last tutorial, but if you don't have it, you should be able to easily follow along, or you can download or clone the starter source code from the link I'm providing in the description below. All right, in Visual Studio Code, we've got our server.js file. And from the previous tutorial, we've got a lot of code in here. And really what we can do is break these routes out into individual routers that are essentially mini servers for each specific route, or mini apps as we create our app with Express here. These will be mini apps and we'll refer to them as routers. So over in the file tree, let's create a new directory and let's call this directory routes. And now inside the routes, we can create routers for each route that we are handling. So let's create a new file here and let's call this subdir.js because we have a subdir directory in our views folder that we haven't handled at all yet. Now in the subdir.js, we need to start out with a few requirements once again. And the first would be Express, just like we did in the regular app or server.js, if you will. So we have require Express. And then after that, just like we have before, we have applied Express. However, now we'll define a router instead of an app. And we'll set this equal to express.router with a capital R. And then we're going to go ahead and need the path module as well from Common Core module in Node.js. So we'll require path. After that, let's just go ahead and put our module.exports and set that equal to router, because that's what we'll always do when we create a router. And then we can import that back in the server.js when we need it. Now we're ready to just pull our routes in. So let's look at the server.js and the routes that we had or did not have at this point for the subdirectory. And I don't believe we had any yet. We were just routing to our specific views for index and the new page. And of course, we were redirecting the old page. So we hadn't handled anything for the subdirectory yet. It has its own index and it has a file called test.html. So I'm going to copy how we handled the index for the root, and then we can just modify that in the subdirectory. And instead of app.get, we now have a router. So let's replace app with router. And now it's router.get. And then we can handle the slash or index for the subdirectory the same way we did for our root. And we have a request and response, and we can remove this commented line that we had in there before. And then we are sending a file, and we're sending the root directory. We get the directory name here. And then we want to have views, but now we have to think about this because we are not inside the root, so we can't just look directly into the views directory. So we need to come up out of the routes directory we created and then into the views directory. And then we're not only just looking for the index, because that would be the root index. Now we need to specify the subdirectory that we have and then the index.html that's within that subdirectory file. After that, let's copy this down, and I can press Shift Alt and the down arrow. I'm using Windows. It may be different if you're on Mac or Linux. And now we have another get route, but this will be for the test.html. And so we can replace index with test and remove the initial slash. We'll leave the HTML optional. This is regex that we can use within the route. And now we're sending a file once again, but instead of sending index, we're sending test, not text.html. And we can save that. Now that we've created the router file for the subdirectory, we need to go back to server.js. And underneath where we serve the static files, and we set that, we need to go ahead and provide a route. And we do that with app.use in the server file. And now let's provide the route that we are providing the router for. And then we can go ahead and require the router that we have created. And now this will be in ./routes/ and there's the subdirectory. And after we provide that, we should be finished. And now this will route any request coming for the subdirectory to the router instead of the routes that we are providing below through app.get, such as index and new page. So this will match in front of these. And of course, we can put all of these in a router, and we will next. But let's go ahead and start the dev server. I'm going to press Control and the back tick, but you can go to the terminal menu and open a new terminal window. And if you remember, we type npm run dev. And this will start our local dev server with NodeMon, which will listen for any changes. And it's on port 3500. So let's go to Chrome, and I'll go to my blank page. I'll type localhost port 3500. And there we've got our index file, and that's fine. But we want to go to the subdirectory and see if this is working. So we've got subdir. And yes, we've got our subdirectory index page. And let's go ahead and see if the test index page in the subdirectory is also working. I said index test.html actually, and there's our test page in the subdirectory as well. Okay, now let's ask for a page that does not exist in this subdirectory, and let's see what we get. Well, we got our 404 page, but there's something important to notice here. In the past, when we've got our 404 page, it had CSS supplied for it. Now, we didn't put CSS on the previous subdirectory pages. That was not included anyway. But if we requested a 404 on any other page that was not in the subdirectory, it does have CSS applied. So why is the CSS not working for our subdirectory? Well, it's because we haven't told Express to use the public folder or public directory, if you will, for the subdirectory. So let's copy this line down with Shift Alt and the down arrow once again. And now we can specify the subdirectory here and tell Express to use that public directory. Before, we didn't supply a directory, but the default is the / anyway. And so that's essentially what we were doing. But we can save these, and now we should be able to go back and request our 404, basically any page that doesn't exist in the subdirectory, and probably get the formatted 404. Yes, now, even though we're in the subdirectory and I requested a page named Dave that doesn't exist, we got a 404 that actually has the CSS supplied. And you can even see the request coming through down here for the CSS in the subdirectory, and it now works. And I'd like to make one quick correction from the last tutorial, that I did provide information that was correct in older versions. However, in newer versions of Express, Express does support regex inside of app.use, and I said it didn't when I compared app.use to app.all. But now you can have regex there. And so if we are to require a router and we put a / with an asterisk here, this would supersede the subdirectory router. In other words, all routes would go to this router if we supplied that. Of course, we don't want to do that, so we want to specifically state just the /, or we could even get more specific and we could say, hey, it must start with the / and it must end with the /. And then, of course, we would only be providing that for the / right here. But that is because it supports regex, and in previous older versions, Express did not support regex inside of app.use, but in the route it now does. Let's go ahead and create a router for this root directory here. So let's say ./routes/root, and now I'll add the semicolon, one more over, and save. And now we need to go ahead and create this route because right now it doesn't exist. So let's go over here to the file tree. I'll collapse the views folder. We don't need to see what's open there, but inside of routes, let's go ahead and create this root.js. And now inside of the root.js file, let's go back to server and grab the routes that we were using for the root. And we have our index page, our new page, and a redirect for an old page. And Control X will cut those out and we can paste those inside of the root, but we also need those imports and basically everything you would normally start out with for a router. These three imports at the top, express, router, and path. So we'll put those at the top of root as well. And then at the bottom, once again, you want to have module.exports and set that equal to the router. Now what haven't we changed yet is the keyword app here that we were using in the server.js. We need to switch to router as well. We can once again get rid of this commented file, and we have to once again consider the route that we're providing, because now we're in the routes folder. So yes, we have the directory name value, but then we need to come up out of the routes folder and then look in the views folder. Now this will be correct now. We're not looking in a subdirectory, so we no longer have to provide it there. Let's go ahead and copy this and paste it into the route for the new page as well. However, the route for the old page is a redirect, and this will be okay to leave it as it is. So let's save the root, and let's go back to the server. We can also get rid of some of these examples of route handlers that we had, such as the hello right here, and the chaining, the route handlers that I had previously provided for the chain route. Let's just delete all of that to clean it up a little bit and save our server.js. It's now restarted, so let's see if these routes are now working with the new router. And we'll come back and just go to the root. And yes, we got the root page. Let's go to /new-page. HTML should be optional, and there's our new page, and our image is working, which means we're getting our static file routed correctly to the public directory where the image is stored. And now let's go to old page and see if the redirect still works. And yes, we redirected back to the new page. Let's go ahead and type in index instead of just the slash. And yes, we still get the index page. Everything in the new router for the root is working correctly. With our routes working correctly, let's talk about how we would set up an API, or a REST API, if you will. And that's what is more important when we're working with, say, the MERN stack, as say Mongo, Express, Node, and of course React on the front end. Or you could substitute any database technology for Mongo, but we've got Node and Express here. And we want to organize a API, which is what we would more than likely create with Node and Express, say, compared to a static server for web pages, although you can do that. It's much more likely that you'll create an API, and that's what we'll focus on here. So underneath these routes, we're going to create one more route, and this will be to employees. And then inside of routes, it's going to be in a subfolder named API and then be employees. And notice this will just be routed by the user going to employees. They will not have to type API. So let's go ahead and save this, and then let's start creating that route. Inside of routes, we want to create another directory, and that's API. And then inside of the API, we want to create our employees router, and that's employees.js. Now up here inside the data folder, we've already got a file named data.json. Let's go ahead and rename this file, and let's call it employees.json. And let's give each employee inside of this file an ID, and we'll just make these chronological. So we've got 1 and an ID of 2. And now that we got that, we can just go ahead and save our small employees data file. And remember, that's employees.json inside the data folder. And we've created the route here inside of server using app.use. Now, it does not need to have any static files, as we'll just be delivering JSON data from our API. So we wouldn't typically have any static files like we would with a web page. So now let's go back to our employees.js route. Let's start out our route just like we did the others. So we want to define express. We'll set this equal to requiring express. And then we want to go ahead and define our router once again, and we'll set this equal to express.router with a capital R and call router into action. And we'll once again need the path, common core module from Node.js, so we can require path. And after path, let's go ahead and define an empty object named data. And from there, let's set data.employees equal to require, and now let's get that JSON file. So we need to go up out of the API folder, and then we need to go up out of the routes folder, then into the data folder, and then to get employees.json. And so this is kind of like connecting to a database. This is just what we're doing for this tutorial and dev. Of course, in the future, we'll work on connecting to Mongo. And of course, you could replace that with your database technology of choice. But once again, just for this tutorial, just for dev, we're just going to import some JSON to simply work with here. So now let's go ahead and create our module.exports and set that equal to router again, as we always do with a router. And now we can set up our routes. Now, instead of just saying router.get and creating another router.post and another router.put, and of course putting those paths in there like we could, one thing we can do is say router.route and then provide the route, and then we can chain the different HTTP methods that we want to provide for this same route, as a GET request and a POST request can both go to the same route, but there can be a different result for each. So let's handle the GET request first, and here's a request and a response. And now inside the handler of the GET request, let's just return JSON, and let's return all the employees. So that will be data.employees. Now for the POST request, we can just come down here and say .post, and once again we can have a request and a response. We can handle this completely differently for the HTTP method POST than we do for GET. And now with the POST, we'll get parameters coming in to the request, and we can refer to those parameters with request.body and then whatever the name of the parameter is. Now we had a first name and a last name, and a POST request would be posting a new employee. So what we want to do, I'm not going to put in the full code that we would have in an API at this moment, because it's not really about coding an API right now. We're handling routes, so we just want to see how each one of these would work. So let's say the first name that we return in the JSON will return what is sent, and that's request.body.firstname. And then let's go ahead and return the last name as well, and that's request.body.lastname. Once again, not writing out all the code for an API at this point, just showing how we can get the parameters from a POST request, and then we're just sending those parameters back. But this is how we could handle each route in an API. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing with a PUT request. We have a request and a response, and this would be the HTTP method that you would use when you're updating an employee, for example. But we could do the same thing. We could get the res.json here, and as a matter of fact, I can just copy this down. And of course, the code would be different if you were writing an actual API, because you would be updating at that point. And we'll do that in the near future, just not going to do it yet. And then let's get a delete. Now, a delete would be different. We wouldn't be getting the first name and the last name. We would be getting the ID. So we'll just send the ID back in this case. And that would be response.json once again. But let's go ahead and send the ID back here, and this would be request.body.id. Now you can see we've chained each HTTP method together, and we've got get, post, put, and delete all coming into the same route on our router. They're just different request methods. And of course, this being the last one, we'll go ahead and stop right there. And I'm going to save this, but we're going to add one more route. We have the route coming in with just the slash, just the root, but then also We could have router.route and then a slash, but we could have a parameter directly in the URL. And that's what we're showing here is a parameter. And this would be a GET request that has a parameter inside of the URL. So now down here, and of course you could do that with other requests too. We're going to use a GET request. So let's go ahead and put the handler for our GET request here. We have our request and response. And now inside the handler, we'll once again respond with JSON, and we'll just say, here's the ID requested. And now this is different. Instead of request.body, it's request.params.id. And that's because we're pulling the parameter, it's a named parameter actually, and we're pulling it directly out of the URL. So here we're responding once again with just what we received. Just as an example, now I'll put in future code. We'll go ahead and actually code out an API. Right now, handling the routes. And so all of this is inside the router, and I guess we didn't need path right here at this moment, so we can get rid of that. But all of this is inside the router for employees. Let's go ahead and save this, and we can test it out. And our server is still running below, so we can now check these routes with Thunder Client. Thunder Client is an extension. In the past, I've used Postman, which is a separate program to test APIs. Let's go ahead and try this extension out. You can find it under Extensions, search for Thunder Client, and it allows you to save different routes you want to test. So right here, I'm going to go ahead and choose the GET route that I created first. There it is for all employees, which of course there's only 2. And you can see here is our HTTP method, and here is the route. And now I'll click send, and here's the response. I can just make the response full screen, but we've got both of our employees returned. And that's exactly what we expected. So now after testing the GET route, let's go ahead and test the post route. So I'll choose that from our list. Well, let me go to collections. I believe I saved everything there. There we go. Let's choose post. And now we're once again going to the employees route, but it's got post. Let's look at the parameters and see if those were saved. And it should be under body actually. There we go. And I'm posting a new employee named John Doe. So let's see if we get that in return. We'll send that, and let's look at what was returned. Yes, we got John Doe sent back to us, and that's all we're going for today once again, is we're not writing out the actual code to add the employee or update the employee and things like that. In the near future, yes, I will. Okay, put should be the next one to test. So now it's a put method at the same URL. And once again, we are sending some John Doe. Oh, actually sending just the ID and the first name of what we wanted to update. And of course, I think I had the put request just sending back the first name and last name. So maybe we'll just get the first name back. Let's see what we get when we test put. And yes, we just got the first name back, and that's what I expected. So that works also. Now let's test the delete route. Of course, it won't actually delete the employee this time around. And looks like we're sending just the ID, and we should get that ID back. Expand, and yes, in return, we've got the ID back. So that route is also working. Now there's one more GET route where we could get a specific employee. And let's see if that one's here or here. Here we go. So this is our route with employees, but then it has slash and the number 1 where we're requesting just one employee, not both. So let's go ahead and send that and see what we get in return. And we returned the ID of 1. So that route is also working. And again, this extension is called Thunder Client if you want to check it out for testing the routes in your API. Now, as a challenge before my next tutorial, you could go ahead and write out the code to update the JSON that we were receiving. And of course, just hold it in memory. Don't really update the file, but you could test out what you want to do here for each of these routes, and you could handle each one of those. And I'll come back with some code for that in the next tutorial. And what I really also want to talk about in the next tutorial is organizing the rest of this API, including the server file, and setting it up, because after that, we'll pretty much be ready to connect everything to whichever database technology we would want to. So we'll organize this with an MVC pattern, that is Model View Controller. And of course, I can come back and add some extra code here to handle the API data just for the JSON as an extra test. It's not really anything to do with specifically Express. That's just JavaScript and handling how you would basically do CRUD operations: create, read, update, and delete. Give this video a like if it helped you get started with the Express framework for Node.js. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.